If you're with us live this afternoon or via cyberspace, we welcome you here and hope that you had a good, restful afternoon. We want to start this evening by singing number 634, My Country 'Tis of Thee. Again, with all the goings on in our country, I think we ought to take an opportunity to show our patriotism at every opportunity we have, however that form comes. So would you stand and would you join us as we sing together? We're going to sing all four stanzas, number 634. Would you take some time to welcome and fellowship this evening?
As you're making your way back towards your seats, if you can get any prayer requests ready that you may have, we'll take those down and get those into the bulletin for next week. And what was his name? Robert Hildebrand. Yeah, we need to remember Dalton. Alan had he had some treatments at Baptist, and they're going to, if I remember right from the text that Francis sent me, that he was going to have a different procedure, and so you need to remember Alan Church. Any others? Miss Vera? Steve? Remember her grandson, Steve Coots. Any others? Dennis, how is your mom doing? We'll get her on here. Remember Edna? Any others? Okay. Okay. All right. Jackie mentioned our healthcare workers and our law enforcement officers. Any others? Okay. Okay. Remember all the. Okay. Remember all those that are traveling and all that sort of stuff. Any others? Any others? All right. Well, if there's not, turn your Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 5. We're going to be in chapter 5 this evening as we continue in our study of the book of Nehemiah. I want to encourage you, as I try to every time we have a Bible study, try and remind you to, or encourage you to read a chapter in the book of Nehemiah each day as you do your daily Bible reading, and sort of familiarize yourself with the book of Nehemiah as we go through this book. Now, last time that we were together, we saw how opposition to the wall, or the reconstruction of the wall, almost stopped the work as it was starting to gain some momentum. And tonight we're going to see how the conditions the people were dealing with while working with the wall could have very easily have derailed the rebuilding process as well. Now, when you get into chapter 5 of Nehemiah, we see in the first 5 verses that some of the people come to Nehemiah, who is the governor, and ask him for some help. And so let's look at verses 1 through 5 this evening. I'm going to read them, and then we'll sort of take a look at what they're saying. It says, beginning in Nehemiah 5:1, it says, "Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, 'We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain.' Others were saying, 'We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine.' Still others were saying, 'We have had to borrow money to pay the king's taxes on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have even been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others.'" And so we see that this rosy picture that we have had painted of the situation in Jerusalem, of the wall getting built back up to half of its height. You know, there is a sort of a Paul Harvey moment here in chapter 5 where we get, see the rest of the story. We see what the real conditions in Jerusalem were like based on chapter 5. We see what is going on and what the people are dealing with outside of this, tremendous and momentous occasion of getting this wall built back up and getting it, as we read a couple chapters, or last time, getting it to about half of its height. Now, after this opposition from the surrounding regions, remember they were surrounded, so to speak. Once that nearly stopped the work on the wall, then it seems like the internal issues that were happening in Jerusalem nearly derailed their efforts. And there were some major issues inside of this Jewish community that affected the people in a major way. It wasn't just one or two people complaining. This was all of the men and the women in Jerusalem. So it seemed like there was a very large constituency of the people in Jerusalem were being affected by these events. And so in these first 5 verses, what we see are 3 different complaints from 2 different groups of people. The first group that we see to complain were people who owned nothing but worked to make a living. In verse 2 it says, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." And so they had to work to provide for their families. They were probably working in the fields, working in the city in different ways, but working mostly in those fields around the area. But the problem with it was there was a famine in the region. There was an issue there that was affecting not just 1 or 2 people, but everybody was affected by this. And so they were impacted by this famine, and work was scarce because if you work in the fields and nothing's growing in the fields, you're out of a job. I mean, it's that simple. And so if they were out of a job, there was no Social Security. There was no government handout, bailouts that would come for them that could help them to get what they needed. And so these people were struggling just to feed their families. I mean, this wasn't so that they could go on vacation or buy a second house or anything like this. They were just trying to put food on the table, and they were struggling even to do that much. And so we see that first group that, and I say complain, but they were voicing issues and problems that were affecting them. We might say they were complaining, but they were bringing these to the person Nehemiah, who could affect change in the city of Jerusalem and in their lives. So the second group that we see that was complaining or bringing these issues were landowners who were being ruined by the famine. Look at verse 3. It says, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." And so this group had to take out loans to get grain for their families to eat during the famine. And the famine made it nearly impossible for them to repay the loans, meaning that they were at risk of losing everything. I mean, so this famine, they had land, but because the land wasn't producing and they couldn't repay their loans, they're on the verge of bankruptcy. They're on the verge of losing everything. So to speak, the bank repossessing or foreclosing on their land. And so they were in danger of losing everything. And then we see that the other complaint by this similar group of landowners was that they had another issue, and it was the government taxes. So not only had they borrowed money to get grain and to try and keep their families fed during all of this time, they also had to still pay their taxes. They still had to pay the government taxes, which would be funneled back to Susa, back to the Persian Empire. And look at verses 4 and 5. They said, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's taxes on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and vineyards belong to others." And so, we talked this morning about slavery to sin, and this is exactly what was happening. This idea of slavery was exactly what was happening inside of the Jewish community here. They had, if I'm not mistaken, I meant to look this up and I forgot to, so I apologize. But if I'm not mistaken, they had what they called the year of Jubilee every 7 years, where they could write off debts, and people that had been indentured as slaves, to pay off their debts. Basically, their debt was wiped clean, and they could be released or bought out of, and all of this. But here we see that these people were struggling just to make ends meet, and so now they're having to pay taxes on top of just trying to feed their families. And because they did have land, they had to pay these taxes, and so they were selling their sons and their daughters into slavery. And so now the fields were mortgaged because they needed to buy food, and the land wasn't producing during the famine, and they had to repay their loans for their taxes. So they sold their children into slavery, and then with no income from the fields, and they had no way to buy their children back out of slavery. They couldn't repay their loans. They couldn't buy their children back. I mean, they were in a bad way. These people were beyond financial ruin. I think we have to understand that. This wasn't like, oh, next week things are going to turn around. They were devastated financially, and they really had no hope of getting out of this situation. And so what we see in the next couple of verses is, first and foremost, Nehemiah's outrage over how those nobles and officials had abused the situation and had, for all intents and purposes, had abused their fellow Jews. It says there in verses 6 and 7 that Nehemiah said, "When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, you are charging your own people interest." Nehemiah was angry at the accusations of the people that they were making against these nobles and officials, because he was upset because the nobles and officials were not just simply charging interest, but this was during a time where the people were devastated. It was, they knew, the nobles and officials, it wasn't like they didn't know what was going on, but they just continued to add on and keep adding and never gave a reprieve to try and help them out. And they had, it was essentially that there was nothing being done to help them out of this dire situation. And, anymore, we live in such a commercialized society that, the banks a lot of times have no remorse a lot of times for hard times and different things like that. And during this, during this recent pandemic and stuff, there's been a lot more leeway in those sort of things than we generally see in our society. But in this society, this sort of thing, this, no remorse, no help, no nothing, was shocking to the people. And it was shocking to Nehemiah. He was angry because of this, because he knew that they knew better. He knew that they should be doing differently, and he knew they could, but they just hadn't. And so the Jews were already a laughingstock in the region. Remember, we talked about that early on. Because their walls were broken down, their gates were burnt, they were essentially a laughingstock in their community or in their region. And the way the Jewish people were treating each other in this way made them look even that much worse to the surrounding people groups. And so those Ammonites and those people of Ashdod and the Sumerians and the Arabs, they're looking at them like, these guys are fools. These guys can't get their act together. And look, now they're selling each other into slavery. It's just, they were a laughingstock. And one reason their neighbors knew about their problems, it wasn't that they were sending spies in to try and find out what was going on in Jerusalem. The problem was, when they were selling their children into slavery, most of them were being sold to the Gentiles, those surrounding people groups around Jerusalem. And so they were buying them, and so they knew, without even asking, without even wondering, they knew how bad the situation was in Jerusalem. To use a term that we've all become very familiar with, a bailout was the only thing that was going to help these people out. That was the only thing that could come close to helping them get out of the situation. Their hole was constantly getting deeper and deeper. You know, there's been many a family get-together where we've been sitting around the table with my parents and my brother and his family and my sister, and we've been laughing and carrying on. And you know, I've never been one that shied away from sticking this size 15 shoe into this big mouth of mine. And so my dad has for years told us, when you find yourself in a hole, quit digging. He says, if you find yourself in a hole, put down the shovel, or something like that. And so regularly he has to remind me of that at these family get-togethers where I'm picking at my wife or aggravating my boys, and all of a sudden I find I've dug my hole too deep. Dad says, Nick, put the shovel down. And I know what he's talking about. He's like, just shut up and things will get better if you just shut up. Well, for them, there was no way for them to set their shovel down. There was no way for them to quit digging their financial hole even worse without this bailout of some sort to help them. So what we see is in the rest of verse 7 and then through verse 13, we see that Nehemiah proposes, or actually pushes and commands, for a solution. He gives his solution and says, this is what's going to happen. So let's look and see what he says there in the rest of verse 7 through 13. It says, so I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your own people only for them to be sold back to us. They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain, but let us stop charging interest. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest you are charging them, 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil. We will give it back, they said, and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. Then I summoned the priest and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised. I also shook out the folds of my robe and said, in this way may God shake out their house and possessions, anyone who does not keep this promise. So may such a person be shaken out and emptied. At this, the whole assembly said, Amen, and praised the Lord. And the people did as they had promised. So Nehemiah essentially wasted no time in scolding and, really laying into these nobles and officials for the way that they were treating their fellow Jews. Nehemiah and the others had been buying back these Jews that had been sold into slavery to the Gentiles. And so what the nobles and officials were doing was they were compounding the problem by continuing to sell their Jews, their Jewish brothers and sisters, into slavery with the Gentiles, causing the Jews that were trying to buy them back to decrease their wealth and their ability to buy and produce and do and all of these things. They were weakening Jerusalem and the Jewish community there in Israel overall, because they were having to continually buy these people back. So they were essentially making their fellow Jews poorer by the slaves having to be bought back from these Gentiles. And so what they were doing was making the Jews poorer and the Gentiles richer. And so these people around them were getting more gold and silver and would be able to buy more weapons and more mercenaries and more army and all of these things. And so it was not a good situation. And Nehemiah could see, to borrow from the book of Daniel, he could see the handwriting on the wall. He could see the problems that would be coming from this, and he's trying to get them to stop. And so Nehemiah points out how wrong their actions were and points out they should be more concerned about the fear of God than losing some money. And so he also pointed out how he and others had been lending money as well. And, they had been doing the same kind of practices that the nobles and the officials were using. They were loaning and stuff. But he called them to immediate action. He didn't say, we're going to sit down and talk about this. We're not going to wait and find out, see if the famine ends or anything like that. Nehemiah called them to action and demanded that they immediately give back their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest they were being charged, 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil. So the nobles and officials, they were taking a major hit. I mean, they were taking a big hit because now, think about this, they were losing houses and olive groves and vineyards and fields. I mean, they were losing out big time. And so you see that there is this shift in the way that they were dealing with their fellow Jews. There was something going on internally. There was something going on in their hearts and that was changing in them, because otherwise, you don't mess with a person's money. That's one of those things. It's just one of those things that you learn in life, is you don't mess with somebody else's money. And, that's a good way to get hurt or put in jail or prison or whatever. But, it wasn't any different then. You didn't just take from somebody without repercussions. And they were a whole lot more savage in the way that they would the way that they would seek revenge and try to find restitution. But nevertheless, these nobles and officials, they are taking a major hit to their wealth and to their finances to not just give back land that they just acquired, but also to give some of that interest back. Not just the money, but oil, and as it says there, grain and wine. I mean, so they were taking a major hit. And so their response, interestingly, was immediate. It wasn't like they said, hey, Nehemiah, we need to think about this for just a minute. Wait, 1%? How about if we do 0.5%? They didn't try to bargain with him. They didn't try to, figure out a, negotiation that worked better for them. They realized in the moment that they were in the wrong, that their actions were wrong in the way they were treating their fellow Jews. And so it says that they, not only returned what Nehemiah demanded, but it also says that they no longer demanded anything from them. So they no longer was saying, it wasn't like they said, here, we'll give you your interest back, this 1%, we'll give you some land and stuff, but you still got to pay on your loans. You still got to pay on your slavery debt. They said, you know what, we're not going to demand anything else from them. And so, that's pretty impressive, the heart change that has gone on in the lives of these nobles and officials. And so Nehemiah, I'm not going to say that he didn't trust them, that Nehemiah knew that if this was real and they had really made a change of heart and were going to follow through with what they were doing, that the best way to make sure this would happen was sort of by getting them to sign a contract. And so what he does is, the way that they would essentially do this covenant was, he got the priest to come in and made them take an oath. And for them, that was the same as signing a contract, essentially. And so it was a covenant, essentially between them and God, saying, God, this is what we're going to do. We're going to give them their stuff back. We're going to give them the interest back, and we're not going to demand anything else from them. And so essentially what Nehemiah was doing was he was holding their feet to the fire, making sure that they did sign the contract, so to speak, that they were going to do exactly what they were going to do. And so what Nehemiah then does is kind of interesting. After they make this oath with the priest and does that, he pronounces this prophetic judgment against them, saying, he shakes out the folds of his robe and essentially says, this is what's going to happen to any individual that doesn't keep their oath. And so, it was kind of interesting when I was reading a commentary this week about this. Sometimes you see in the Bible when a prophet or, someone in the Bible may do something like that and say, this is what God will do to the man who does or doesn't do whatever. And it was kind of interesting that one of the commentaries I was reading talked about how it was as if they were calling God's attention to the matter and said, God, this is what you need to do to the person. Almost like they were kind of holding God hostage on it, saying, God, look, this is what you need to do, and whatever the thing was, if they don't follow through. It's almost signing God's name to the dotted line, saying, this is what God's going to do to you. Nehemiah was a very religious man in the way that he prayed and carried on with God and stuff. And so, in this case, we see that, he's saying, this is what God will do if you don't follow through with your oath. And so it wasn't so much that he was holding God's feet to the fire as he's saying, okay, your side of the oath is that you're going to give this stuff back. Well, this is God's side of the oath, saying, if you don't, this is what I'm going to do to you. And so Nehemiah makes this sort of prophetic judgment, and the nobles and officials, they agreed to the oath, and then they did as they had promised. That's the key thing to see here, is that they didn't tell Nehemiah one thing and make this oath and then go do something different. They said, this is what we'll do, and this is what they did. And so they followed through with what they said they were going to do. So we get to the end of this major internal issue in the Jewish community there in Jerusalem during Nehemiah's day. And then we see in verses 14 through 19, what we see is just this sort of snippet of Nehemiah's governorship. So let's look at verses 14 through 19 as we finish up chapter 5 tonight. It says in verse 14, it says, "Moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to food and wine. Their assistants also lorded it over the people. But out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled from there for the work. We did not acquire any land. Furthermore, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. Each day 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me, and every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of all this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because the demands were heavy on these people. Remember me with favor, my God, for all I have done for these people." So in these last 6 verses, we get a snapshot of some of Nehemiah's time as a governor. But more importantly, Nehemiah is showing us how he didn't abuse the people like or he didn't abuse his position or the power he had as governor like people had previously. And so we find out that Nehemiah's first term as governor was 12 years, because we knew that he started in the year 445 BC in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. And so we knew when that was, and then he even referenced, it was the 20th year, and then in his 32nd year, so easy math is that's 12 years. But so his first governorship ran from 445 BC to 433 BC. And we also find out that during those 12 years that Nehemiah did not take any of the allotment of food that the people were supposed to provide for the governor. I mean, think about that. That's 12 years worth of a tax break, so to speak, if you want to look at it that way, because it was a government tax that was being forced on the people. And so they had 12 years worth of a tax break of not having to provide this food and wine for the governor. And not only that, as we read in verse 15, prior governors had asked for an additional 40 shekels of silver. And so it was bad enough that they had to pay for their governor tax, so to speak, by providing the food and the wine, but they also had to pay out of their own pocket, the cash out of their pocket with this silver that they were forced to give. Now, many government officials, not just the ones in Jerusalem, but during this time, government abuse, I guess you would say, of the financial system was not unheard of. A lot of people became very wealthy by taking these positions and then adding extra taxes that the people gradually paid. Sort of like how you sometimes hear the question asked, how does someone go into maybe being a senator or something like that and not be all that wealthy, but then come out on a small salary being multimillionaires? It's been around forever, I think, is the best way to look at it. It's obvious that there's been abuses of that sort of positions of power for millennia, because this was 500 years before Christ, so this has been going on at least 2,500 years. But what we see is that they had become very wealthy in this way. People did. But Nehemiah, his main concern was not making more for himself. His concern, as you see throughout the whole book so far, his concern has been about rebuilding the wall. That's what he's been concerned about. He didn't act like the previous governors did. He was just worried about rebuilding the wall. He wasn't concerned about increasing his wealth or buying property, as it says there. He wasn't worried about those things. If anything, he decreased his wealth. Now, we don't know how wealthy he was when he came to Jerusalem from Susa, but what we can imagine is that he did have some amount of wealth, and that the king sent some with him, and that he probably did receive something of a paycheck, if you want to call it, from the Persian Empire. But he didn't do anything to try and increase his wealth in a deceitful way. But what he did was he actually decreased his wealth by providing all of this food for, as he said, 150 Jews and officials, plus those people from the surrounding governments that would be visiting in Jerusalem. He was providing meals for them as well. And so he was actually probably decreasing his wealth during this time. And so despite this heavy cost of providing all of this food and all of this wine for all of these people, Nehemiah never demanded his allotment because the people already had a heavy burden on them. He wasn't concerned about that. He just wanted to get the wall rebuilt. And so you can imagine that this was a great 12 years with Nehemiah leading there in Jerusalem. And now Nehemiah closes out this part of the text by simply just asking God to remember his actions. Remember what I've done for the people of Jerusalem. Just remember how I have treated them. Remember what I have done. And, and that's really where Nehemiah chapter 5 ends. But, as we've been talking through this series, we've looked every night at how the hand of the Lord has been impacting how he impacted the situation in the chapter that we just read, but also how he can impact our lives and influence our lives today. The way we can see the hand of the Lord in this particular chapter is through the way he moved the hearts of the nobles and the officials to care for the less fortunate in their community. Because essentially it was the nobles and the officials and then everybody else. And everybody else was being hurt by this famine. And they were losing everything. For us, it would probably, something that we could probably correlate it to would probably be something like the Great Depression. That would probably be an idea of something similar. People just losing everything. And so even though Nehemiah demanded the nobles and officials to take this substantial, tremendous loss, they could have refused to do it. That's what we have to see. It wasn't all sunshine and roses and rainbows and, oh yeah, Nehemiah, we're going to give up all this land and all this money and we're going to do all of this. Yeah. No, they weren't excited about this. I'm sure they were, not too happy to have to do this. And they could have very easily have said, you know what, Nehemiah? No. We're going to get somebody else to be governor, and we'll deal with the ramifications later. But no, we're not going to follow you. We're not going to listen to you. We're not going to do what you say. And so they could have refused to do it and even tried to overthrow Nehemiah if they really wanted to. But instead, they acted in accordance with what God demanded of them in the law of Moses. And so that's what they were doing. They helped out their fellow Jews by giving back so much to them. And so we see that what they were doing is they were trusting Nehemiah's leadership, but they were also saying, okay, what does the Word of God say that we should be doing? Okay, that's what we're going to do. And that's how they were looking at it, sort of through this biblical lens, if you want to look at it that way. But the way that we see the hand of the Lord in the same way today is when God uses us to care for those in our community who are in need or unable to help themselves out of their situation. Just like the nobles and the officials of Nehemiah's day, if we have the means and the abilities to help those in need, then we really should do that. And I think that, our church has a real heart for caring for our community. I mean, think about the food ministry, think about the clinic, and the other ministries that we do that reach out to folks in our community. We do have as a collective group of believers, we have a great system or a process, if you want to call it that, for caring for those in our community who are less fortunate, those that may need some help, and maybe just need something to help get them through. But we aren't on an excuse me, we are not on an individual basis. As far as I know, we're not taking advantage of the people in our community the same way that the Jewish nobles and officials were doing with the people in Jerusalem. We're not doing that and then getting called out on it. But what we have, when we have the wherewithal to help someone, we ought to allow God to move in our hearts in such a way that we help them, and then we should just do it. The easiest explanation of this is in Matthew chapter 7, when we talk about Jesus talking to us in the Sermon on the Mount. He says in Matthew 7:12, he says, "So in everything do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets." What do we call that? The golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I mean, think about it. If you were in that position in our community to where you were needing that help, and you knew someone else that had the wherewithal and they stepped in to help, wouldn't you want that? I mean, we would. And so we see that not just from the days of Nehemiah, but we see this in the days of Jesus speaking, saying, do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. And so when we look at those in our community that may need some help, or we have the opportunity to help them, we ought to look at it from the other side of the coin and be like, okay, if I were on the receiving end of this, how would I feel? Would I be able to, would that be a help to me? And so, if we're able to help others in need, then we should help them like we would want to be helped if we were in that same position. And so, it's a matter of a change of heart, as we saw in the nobles and the officials, and we need to make sure that God is working in our hearts to change us when we have that opportunity to help others, and he gives us that opportunity. We ought to take advantage of it. And so that is the end of